In a small village in West Africa, surrounded by the greenery of dense forests, lived Naomi, a beautiful and energetic woman with deep-set eyes and skin that glistened in the sun like polished obsidian. Naomi was married to Tembo, a good-natured and hard-working farmer whose strong arms and sturdy shoulders were used to hard work. They had been living together for several years, and their marriage seemed calm and measured. The village revered them as an exemplary couple, and their little house was always full of laughter and comfort. Naomi was known in the village as a caring hostess and a good wife. She got up early every morning to prepare breakfast for her husband and send him to the field, where he worked from dawn to dusk. Tembo was a man who had no enemies. He was always ready to help his neighbors without demanding anything in return. He was like an oak tree, strong, reliable, and unshakable at a point. But underneath this apparent idyll, there was longing. Naomi felt like her life had stopped. The daily routine, taking care of the house and endless housework, became a heavy burden for her. Her soul craved more. She dreamed of passion, of strong feelings, of something that would make her heart beat faster. Tembo loved her, but his love was calm and predictable, like a river that always flows in one direction. And Naomi wanted to be a mountain river, bubbling and unpredictable, sparkling under the sun. Sometimes when the sun was already setting and the sky was beginning to turn red, Naomi would go out on the porch of their house and look into the distance. At such moments, she recalled the time when she was young and full of hope. Her heart was filled with longing for the days when the world seemed full of possibilities and wonders. She often wondered what had become of that girl who dreamed of more than just being a good wife. Where was the spark that once burned in her? One day, as she stood there, breathing in the evening air and looking at the slowly darkening sky, Tembo came up to her. His face was tired, but a smile lit up his features anyway.
"Are you okay? What is it?"
he asked, putting his arm around her shoulders. Naomi smiled back, but her eyes remained sad.
"Yes, I'm just thinking."
She replied quietly without taking her eyes off the horizon. Tembo nodded and hugged her tighter. He wasn't a man of words, but his presence always gave Naomi a sense of security. Nevertheless, there was a growing feeling inside her that she needed something more than just this calm, monotonous existence. A few weeks later, Meshach, Tembo's younger brother, returned to the village. He was the complete opposite of his older brother. Tall and slender, with a sly smile and sharp eyes, Meshach radiated confidence and charisma. He has spent the last few years in the city, where he worked in trade, and now he has returned to his native village to help his brother with the farm. Meshach was the one who brought the wind of change with him. His manners and lifestyle were different from the usual ones in the village. He wore bright clothes, and his speeches were full of stories about urban life, full of adventures and surprises. He was a man who knew what he wanted and knew how to get it. From the first day of his return, he attracted the attention of all the women of the village, including Naomi. She first saw him when he was walking down the village street with a long stride, as if he was the master of everything around him. His smile was dazzling, and she felt her heart beat a little faster as he passed by. At that moment, she realized that a new force had appeared in her life, which she could not resist. Naomi began to find more and more reasons to be around Meshach. She offered to bring him water when he was working with Tembo in the field, or happened to be in the place where he was talking to neighbors. Every time their eyes met, there was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. Meshach noticed this and smiled his sly smile, which made Naomi feel like she was in her youth, despite the fact that she tried to keep her distance. Naomi's heart accelerated every time she saw him. Her thoughts began to circle around the bag like a moth around a flame. She knew it was wrong. She knew she had to be a faithful wife, but there was nothing she could do. She felt attracted to this man who was so unlike Tembo. Meanwhile, Tembo was pleased with his brother's return. They worked in the fields together, laughed and shared memories of their childhood. He didn't notice the changes in his wife, didn't see the sparkle in her eyes every time she saw Meshach. Tembo was sure that his marriage was strong, that his wife was happy, and he could not imagine that a real storm was going on inside her. One day, when Tembo went to a nearby village to sell some of the harvest, Naomi was left alone with Meshach. It was a hot day, and the sun was at its zenith, flooding everything with its inexorable light. Naomi was doing household chores when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Meshach standing in the doorway. His shirt was unbuttoned, and beads of sweat glistened on his chest.
Are you alone here? What is it?
He asked, not taking his eyes off Naomi. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt heat engulf her body. She nodded, trying not to show her excitement. She knew it was a dangerous situation, but she couldn't help but notice how attracted she was to him. Meshach came closer, and she could smell him. A mixture of sweat and earth, the smell of a man who lived a full life, who was not afraid to take risks. Naomi tried to focus on her business, but her hands were shaking. She could feel his gaze penetrating to the very depths of her soul, as he saw what she was trying to hide even from herself. There was a fire burning inside her that she couldn't put out. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling that filled her with energy and excitement. She knew she had to stop. She had to leave, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She stood looking at Meshach and couldn't take her eyes off him. He took a step forward, and their hands accidentally touched. This moment was like a flash of lightning, like an explosion that lit up everything inside her. She felt her breathing quicken, and she could barely stand. At that moment, she realized that she could no longer ignore her feelings. She knew she was risking everything, that she could lose everything she had, but she couldn't live in the shadow of her desires anymore. She wanted a sack. She wanted to feel the passion that was burning inside her, and she was ready to do anything for it. She took a step back, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she had a difficult choice ahead of her, that she was on the verge of something important, but she couldn't turn back. She felt attracted to this man, as if an invisible force was pulling her towards him, and she couldn't resist. She knew that this was just the beginning of something that would change her life forever. Time in the village flowed slowly and steadily, like a river that lazily flowed along the borders of their land. The winds brought freshness in the morning, and every day began with the same rituals. Men went to the fields, and women stayed to take care of the house and children. Naomi followed this cycle with patience, but deep down she knew that something was missing. One early morning, when it was just getting light, the news swept through the village. Meshach, Tembo's younger brother, was returning to the village after many years spent in the city. This news has excited the residents. Meshach was known for his energy, ambition, and love of adventure. His absence had been discussed in whispers around the campfires and in the market square for a long time, and now he was returning. Naomi found out about his return from a neighbor who came running to share the news. She listened to the woman with polite interest, but something new was awakening inside her. The memories of the bag, which she had kept in the depths of her memory for a long time, suddenly surfaced. She remembered him as a young, hot guy, full of life and passion, completely unlike his older brother Tembo. And now he was coming back, and something about that return promised a change. Since the morning, there has been a fuss in Naomi's house. Tembo was preparing to meet his brother, and his face was shining with joy. He often talked about how he missed Meshach, and now their family is reuniting. Naomi was watching her husband, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She tried to convince herself that all she cared about was that Meshach was finally coming home, but her heart was beating faster than usual. When the figure of a man walking along a dusty road appeared on the horizon, the village held its breath. Naomi stood on the threshold of their house, looked into the distance, and felt a strange excitement come over her. As the figure approached, she saw him, Meshach, tall, with broad shoulders and a confident gait, carrying the smell of the city and distant countries. His face was slightly tanned, and his eyes shone as if he saw a world that was hidden from the rest. Tembo rushed to his brother with a shout of joy and hugged him tightly. Naomi stood to the side, watching this scene, and couldn't take her eyes off Meshach. He has grown, changed, become more masculine and attractive. His eyes met hers for a moment, and at that moment she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if a spark had passed between them, something dangerous and alluring at the same time.
Naomi, come here.
Tembo called to her, laughing and hugging his brother.
Now, look who's back.
She walked over slowly, trying to stay calm, even though everything was boiling inside. She smiled, trying not to show how much she was excited by his arrival.
Meshach.
She said, nodding in greeting.
No. Welcome home.
Thank you, Naomi.
He replied, and his voice was low, velvety, like the whisper of the wind in the night.
I am glad to see my native places again.
This moment seemed to last forever. Their eyes met again, and Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. For the first time in many years, she felt a surge of passion, which she had long buried under the routines of everyday life. And from that day on, Meshach's presence became an integral part of life in the village. He brought with him the energy and excitement that these quiet places had been lacking for a long time. Women whispered about him. Men admired his stories about life in the city, and children ran after him like a hero. Meshach was a stranger and his own at the same time. He was like a wind of change that dispersed the stagnant water of village life. Naomi watched him every day, trying to do it unnoticed. She saw how he joked with the neighbors, how his smile lit up his face, how his laughter resounded through the village, filling it with joy and light. But she noticed something else in his eyes, some secret hidden deep inside, something that attracted her and excited her imagination. One day, when Tembo went hunting in the forest with the men of the village, and Naomi was left alone to do household chores, Meshach approached her while she was carrying water from the well. She felt his presence long before she heard his footsteps. Her heart began to beat faster, and she pretended not to notice him.
Can I help you? What is it?
He asked, coming closer. Naomi turned around and saw him. He was standing so close that she could feel his breath on her skin. She knew she should refuse, but something in his gaze, in his confidence and calmness made her nod. They worked in silence, but there was a tension between them that was almost palpable. Every time their hands accidentally touched, Naomi felt something light up inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling that scared and attracted at the same time. After that day, Naomi began to look for reasons to be near Meshach. She knew it was dangerous, that she was playing with fire, but she couldn't help herself. Every time she was near him, her heart beat faster and her thoughts became bolder. She knew it was wrong. She knew she was betraying her husband, but she couldn't stop. Meshach was like a magnet drawing her to him, and she was willing to take risks for the sake of this feeling. Tembo, as usual, did not notice the changes in his wife. He was absorbed in work and taking care of the house, rejoiced at the return of his brother, and did not see how his wife was changing before his eyes. Naomi, on the other hand, felt desire growing inside her, how she was attracted to Meshach, how her body and soul were drawn to him. And then one day, when they were alone again, Naomi couldn't contain her feelings. She stood in front of him, her heart pounding in her chest, and she saw his eyes looking at her with the same fire that burned in her. It was the moment when everything fell into place, when she realized that she could no longer ignore her feelings.
Meshach.
Mew, she whispered, feeling her voice tremble. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same desire, the same longing that was boiling inside her. They stood like that, not moving, until the whole world narrowed down to one moment, to one decision. And at that moment, she realized that she couldn't resist anymore. She took a step forward, and their lips met in a kiss full of passion and despair. It was a kiss that changed everything, a kiss that was filled with forbidden desire and uncontrollable passion. Naomi felt her heart stop, her body burn from the touch of the bag. It was something new, something forbidden and alluring, something she had long dreamed of, but was afraid to admit even to herself. They pulled away, and Naomi saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. It was a dangerous feeling, a feeling that could destroy everything they had, but they couldn't stop. They both knew it was wrong, that they were risking everything, but they couldn't give it up. Their bond was too strong to ignore, too deep to forget. From that moment on, their lives changed. Every day was a test. Every look was a secret that they hid from everyone. They met secretly, stealthily, like thieves sneaking in the night. Since Meshach returned to the village, Naomi's daily life has changed. Her days became brighter, her heart beat faster, and the world seemed to come alive with new colors. He brought with him the wind of change, and this shock penetrated into every pore of her being. Now, every morning, when Naomi got out of bed, she thought about when she would see Meshach again. She couldn't take her eyes off him as he passed by, and she felt her heart skip a beat at his gaze. Meshach moved into Tembo and Naomi's house. His presence was felt everywhere, in his loud, booming laughter, in his clear, confident voice when he told his stories about life in the city, and in his light, relaxed movements when he helped his brother with the housework. Unlike Tembo, Meshach was alive, full of energy and drive, and this could not but attract Naomi. They were often alone when Tembo was out in the field or doing village business. Naomi could feel their communication becoming more open each time. At first it was just brief glances, furtively thrown at each other, then random touches that made her skin crawl. She saw how his eyes followed her, how he looked at her with some special warmth and interest, and felt something new arise between them, something that she could no longer ignore. One of these days, Naomi was cooking lunch in the kitchen. Tembo was out hunting, and Meshach came in from the street, covered in dust and sweat from his morning work. He walked across the room and stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her as she cut vegetables with a concentrated look. At that moment, she felt his gaze on her. Her hands froze for a moment, and she looked up. Their eyes met, and the air seemed to be charged with electricity.
It's been a hard day.
He said, wiping the sweat from his forehead, but not taking his eyes off her face. She just nodded, trying to stay calm. But her heart was beating like crazy. She knew she had to look away, that this moment was too dangerous, but she couldn't do it. There was something in his eyes that beckoned to her, something that promised more than she could have imagined. He came closer, and she felt her breathing quicken. Her body tensed, but she couldn't move. He stopped so close that she could feel his warmth, his scent mixed with sweat and earth. It was the scent of a man full of life and strength, and it was driving her crazy.
Ming, can I help you? What is it?
He asked, smiling slightly, his voice low and velvety.
Of course.
She answered faintly, and her voice sounded unexpectedly weak, like a whisper. He came closer, took the knife from her hand, and their fingers touched for a moment. The contact was brief, but it was enough to make her tremble with excitement. She felt the warmth spreading through her body, the blood rushing to her cheeks. She knew it was wrong. She knew that her feelings for Meshach were dangerous, but she couldn't bring herself to move away. Meshach started chopping vegetables next to her, and their shoulders touched each other. This close contact seemed unbearable to her, but at the same time she craved it. She tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts were only about how his hand was touching her, how his body felt next to hers. She felt her heart constrict every time he made a move, and it seemed to her that he felt the same way. A few moments passed in silence, broken only by the sound of a knife cutting vegetables. Naomi could feel the tension building as the air around them became heavy and thick. She knew it couldn't go on forever. She knew that sooner or later this moment would snap apart like a taut string. Suddenly, the knife fell out of her hands, and they both bent down to pick it up at the same time. Their hands touched again, and this time it wasn't just a touch. It was like an electric shock coursing through their bodies, as if something had flared up between them. She froze, feeling his fingers wrap around her arm, and looked up to meet his gaze. He was looking at her with an expression that made her hold her breath. There was passion in his eyes, so intense and unbridled that she couldn't help but notice it. She saw in his gaze the answer to her own feelings, saw that he also felt this attraction, this unstoppable force that pulls them towards each other. They stayed in this position for a few seconds, but for Naomi it felt like an eternity. She felt the world around her disappear, as if only the two of them remained, immersed in this moment, in this feeling that could not be described in words. She knew that this was a moment of choice, that their fate was being decided now. Naomi didn't know which of them took the first step, but their lips suddenly met in a short but passionate kiss. It was like an explosion, like a fire that instantly engulfed them both. Her heart began to beat so hard that it seemed to burst out of her chest, and at that moment she realized that she could no longer resist this feeling. She pulled away, her eyes burning with excitement and fear. She knew it was wrong, that she had just cheated on her husband, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She looked at Meshach, and in his eyes she saw the same thing: passion, desire, and surprise at what had just happened.
We shouldn't.
She began, but her voice was shaking and she couldn't finish the sentence. She knew she had to stop, but her body wouldn't obey. He also retreated, but there was not a drop of remorse in his gaze. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time, as if she was something he had been looking for a long time. Naomi realized that this moment had changed everything. She felt that they had crossed a line that was not worth crossing, but now there was no way back. After that day, their relationship became even more complicated. Every time they were alone, the tension between them grew. They tried to avoid each other, but they couldn't. They were drawn to each other like two opposite sides of a magnet. Every look, every smile, every chance encounter filled them with desire and passion that could not be contained. Naomi tried to avoid meeting Meshach, but her body and soul longed for his presence. She couldn't forget that brief kiss that changed everything. Her thoughts kept returning to him, and she knew she couldn't ignore her feelings anymore. She saw him in her dreams, felt his touch, even when she was alone. Her inner conflict was growing every day. On the one hand, she knew that her feelings for Meshach were a betrayal of Tembo, the man who was loyal to her and loved her. On the other hand, she was attracted to Meshach so much that she couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a feeling that was impossible to control, a feeling that consumed her head. Meanwhile, Meshach continued to behave as usual, but Naomi could see that he also felt this attraction. Since the day Meshach returned to the village, Naomi's life has been filled with new energy, but also new contradictions. Every day her attraction to Meshach grew stronger, as if an unknown force was pulling her into a deep vortex of feelings and emotions that she could not and did not want to suppress anymore. Every morning began with thoughts of him. Every evening ended with dreams of his touch. Naomi tried to convince herself that this was just a passing infatuation, that her feelings for her husband's brother were nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But her body and mind stubbornly refused to obey this logical explanation. She couldn't stop her heart from beating faster every time he was around, and couldn't control her breathing when his eyes met hers. She knew that every look, every smile between them was taking her further away from her former life, and from the husband to whom she had sworn to be faithful. Tembo remained in the dark. He was pleased with his brother's return, and did not notice how his wife began to change. Meshach didn't betray his feelings either, although Naomi saw how his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, how his hands seemed to be looking for an excuse to accidentally touch her. Something flared up between them that couldn't be ignored. It was more than just attraction, more than just passion. It was a desire to be closer, which they could not. One afternoon, when Tembo went into the forest for a few days to look for game, Naomi was left alone with Meshach in their house. It was one of those rare opportunities when they could be alone without the risk of being noticed. Naomi could feel the anxiety building inside her. She tried to find something to distract herself, but her thoughts kept returning to him. Naomi decided to go to the river to get some water and put her thoughts in order. The forest around was dense, the trees reaching up to the sky, blocking out the sunlight and creating a cool shadow. She went down to the water, where the gentle lapping of the river soothed her. She knelt down to scoop up the water, and at that moment she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw Meshach. He was standing on the shore, his eyes fixed on her, and there was an intensity in his gaze that reflected her own feelings. Naomi's heart began to beat faster, but she couldn't take her eyes off it. There was something about that look that attracted her and scared her at the same time. Meshach came closer, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew she had to say something. She had to stop it somehow, but the words stuck in her throat. She looked at him, and her heart was beating with anxiety, but at the same time a strange, painful desire burned inside her. The water glistened in the sun, reflecting their faces as in a mirror. Naomi saw his face coming closer, his eyes never leaving hers, and there was so much determination in that look, so much desire, that she couldn't ignore it anymore. A storm of emotions raged inside her. Fear, excitement, expectation, all mixed into one. He moved even closer, and she felt his breath on her skin. This moment seemed to last forever. Naomi knew it was wrong. She knew she was betraying her husband, but she couldn't stop herself. She felt herself drawn to him, as if an invisible force was pushing her forward, and finally their lips met. It was like an explosion, like a flash of lightning that lit up everything around. The kiss was hot, passionate, full of everything they were hiding inside themselves. Naomi felt a wave of warmth sweep over her body as her heart freezes for a moment and then begins to beat even harder. She returned his kiss, sinking into this feeling, getting lost in it. Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she pulled him closer, as if she was afraid this moment might end. She could feel his arms around her, his body pressed against hers, and that was what she had been craving for so long. This was the feeling she was looking for, the feeling she wanted to experience over and over again. But as soon as their lips parted, Naomi was overcome with remorse. Her heart began to beat uneasily again, and she felt something break inside her. She stepped back, and her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe what she'd just done. She betrayed her husband, a man who had always been faithful to her, who loved her. She knew it shouldn't have happened, that it was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She was overcome with guilt, mixed with bitter pleasure at what had happened. She felt torn apart. One part of her longed to continue, wanted to experience this feeling again, and the other part was tormented by the realization of what she had done. She was overcome by the feeling that she had lost control of her life, that she had allowed her emotions to take over. Meshach was standing in front of her, and his face was serious. He also understood what had just happened, understood that they had crossed a line that could not be crossed. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own feelings, desire and guilt mixed into one. He also knew that they had made a mistake, but was it really a mistake? Naomi felt herself shaking with inner conflict. She closed her eyes, trying to banish these feelings, but they did not go away. She knew that now their lives would not be the same, that they had changed everything they had forever. She felt torn apart. Her heart ached that she had betrayed her husband, but at the same time she could not forget the sweetness of that kiss. She could not forget what she felt when she was in the arms of Meshach. Her body burned like it was on fire, and she couldn't put out that fire. She knew that this kiss was more than just a passing infatuation. It was an expression of everything she hid inside herself, everything she was afraid to admit even to herself. She knew that now she would not be able to return to her old life. She would not be able to forget Meshach and live as before. Meshach continued to look at her, and his gaze was full of understanding and sympathy. He also knew what they had done, knew what lay ahead, but he could not bring himself to move away. They both stood on the edge of the abyss, knowing that the unknown was ahead of them, but they could not stop. Naomi felt a wave of despair sweep over her. She knew she had to make a choice, that she had to decide what to do next, but she couldn't. Her heart and mind were in conflict, and she couldn't find a way out. She wanted to be with Meshach, but she knew it would lead to trouble. She wanted to go back to her husband, but she knew she would never be able to look at him the same way again. She took a step back, and her eyes filled with tears again. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to deal with these feelings. She wanted to run away, to hide from it all, but she knew she couldn't run away from herself. Her heart was tearing apart, and she felt like she was losing control of her life. That evening, when Naomi returned home, her heart was heavy. She couldn't find a place for herself, couldn't calm down. After that fateful kiss on the riverbank, a bond developed between Naomi and Meshach that was too strong to ignore and too dangerous to talk about. Every time they were around, their hearts began to beat faster, and the air became thick with unexpressed emotions and hidden desires. A new stage began in their lives, when every moment spent together became filled with inexpressible tension and deep passion, but also with the constant fear that someone might catch them. At first they tried to avoid each other, trying not to be in the same place at the same time, but their attraction was too strong. The more they tried to distance themselves from each other, the more they were pulled back, like magnets drawn by inevitable force. Naomi knew it was wrong, that their relationship violated all norms and destroyed trust, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Her heart yearned for the fire she felt when she was with Meshach. Meshach, in turn, felt the same attraction to Naomi. He understood that their relationship could lead to disaster, that they were playing with fire that could burn everything around them, but he could not resist these feelings. Every time he saw Naomi, his heart skipped a beat and his breath caught in desire. He knew he had to keep his distance, but his mind and body defied logic, Their secret meetings have become more frequent and more risky. They were looking for secluded places away from prying eyes, on the outskirts of the village, in the shade of dense trees, behind an old barn that had not been used for a long time. There they could be themselves. They could open up to each other and let their feelings take over. Every time their bodies touched, it was like an explosion, like a fire that burns everything in its path. One day they met in the forest where the villagers rarely went. The day was hot and the air was saturated with the scent of flowering trees and dust. They hid in the depths of the forest, where the leaves of the trees created a thick shadow. Their hearts were beating anxiously, but at the same time they felt more alive than ever. It was their secret, their little world where they could be themselves without fear or judgment. Naomi felt a wave of passion sweep over her as Meshach wrapped his arms around her, hugging her to him. She could feel his warmth, his breath on her skin, and at that moment all her fears disappeared. She knew they were playing with fire. She knew that their every touch was bringing them closer to disaster, but she couldn't stop. This moment was more important than anything in the world. It was filled with so many emotions and sensations that she lost her head. However, every time they returned from their secret hideout, the fear of exposure gripped them both. They knew that rumors had already started circulating in the village. People noticed how often they disappeared at the same time, how their gazes lingered on each other longer than necessary. The old women sitting on the porches of their houses were talking to each other, whispering in each other's ears as Naomi passed by. The men looked at Meshach with suspicion and interest, wondering what was going on. Tembo also began to suspect something. He noticed how his wife became more distracted, how often she left the house without explaining where she was going. He saw how eyes sparkled when she looked at Meshach, and how she avoided his gaze. Suspicions began to form in his head, which he tried to drive away, but they returned again and again, becoming stronger. Every evening, when Tembo returned home, Naomi felt anxiety creeping over her. She knew that they could no longer hide their connection, that sooner or later the truth would come out. She tried to behave as usual, smile at her husband, cook dinner for him, but her thoughts were only about what would happen next. She was afraid of the moment when their secret would be revealed, and at the same time she longed for these meetings, this passion that gave her the feeling that she was alive. One night, when Tembo left for a nearby village, Naomi and Meshach decided to meet in an old barn outside the village. It was their safest place, their refuge from the whole world. The barn had been abandoned for a long time, and none of the villagers had entered it. They knew that no one would see them there, that they could be themselves there. They made their way to the barn under cover of night, when the moon disappeared behind clouds and the village fell asleep. It was dark and quiet inside the barn, and only their breathing broke the silence. Naomi felt her heart beating faster and faster, as a feeling came over her that something was going to happen. She knew they were risking everything, but she couldn't stop. Meshach hugged her, and she felt a wave of warmth sweep over her body. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, and the whole world disappeared around them. They forgot about everything, immersed in their desire, in their passion, which was stronger than both of them. At that moment, it was just the two of them, and nothing else mattered. However, even at this moment, they could feel fear seeping into their consciousness as it squeezed their hearts. They knew they were playing with fire. They knew that sooner or later they would be caught, but that knowledge couldn't stop them. Their bodies said one thing and their minds said another, and they couldn't find a way out of this situation. The day after their meeting in the barn, Naomi felt like her life was hanging by a thread. Her heart was pounding with anxiety, and she knew she couldn't go on living like this anymore. She felt a sense of guilt creeping over her, an inner conflict tearing her apart. On the one hand, she knew that she was betraying her husband, a man who had always been faithful to her and loved her, and on the other hand, she could not give up this love, this feeling that gave her a sense of life. She began to avoid people more and more, trying to avoid the eyes of neighbors and village elders. Her fear of exposure grew every day, and she felt panic creep over her every time someone asked her questions. She knew that her eyes and expression could give her away, and she tried to stay as far away from everyone as possible. But even at that moment, she couldn't stop dating Meshach. Every time they were together, a wave of passion and desire swept over her. which washed away all her fears and doubts. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop. Every time they were together, it was like the first time, like something new and forbidden that she couldn't ignore. With each passing day, their secret relationship became more strained. They knew that anyone could expose them at any moment, but they couldn't stop. They were attracted to each other, as if they were made for each other, and nothing could change that. They were like two flames that merged into one, burning brighter and brighter until there was nothing left but. Naomi felt her life getting more and more out of control. She knew she couldn't keep living this lie anymore, but she didn't know how to stop. She was afraid that if they continued, they would be caught, and then everything they had would be destroyed. She was afraid that she would lose everything, but she could not give up this love, this feeling that had become the meaning of her life. The days dragged on inexorably, and each of them was filled with unbearable tension that hung over Naomi and Meshach like a thundercloud ready to burst at any second. They knew that their secret relationship had reached a critical point, and they felt that something was bound to happen. Their love was both a sweet salvation and a painful burden that was impossible to get rid of. Their every touch, every stolen glance under the cover of night, and every moment spent together seemed to only fuel the fire that threatened to burn everything around. They could no longer deny that their connection was what destroyed their lives, but also what filled them with meaning. Their hearts were squeezed with fear and guilt, but the thirst to be together overcame everything. Every time they met, they were drawn to each other more strongly, as if the sky itself was being torn apart when they tried to resist this attraction. Naomi tried to pretend that everything was the same as before, but deep down she knew that her husband, Tembo, already suspected something. His gazes became more and more piercing, and his silence became more and more painful. He saw how Naomi increasingly avoided him, how her eyes did not find him when he spoke to her, and how her body shrank when she felt his touch. She tried to play her role, to be who she was before, but her heart had long belonged to someone else, and she couldn't hide it. One evening, when Tembo went to the forest to check the traps, Naomi and Meshach decided to meet by the river, where it all started. This place became their secret hideout, a place where they could be themselves, where no one could see or judge them. The moon was high, and its light reflected in the water, creating the illusion of another world where there are no prohibitions and boundaries. They sat on the shore, holding hands, and felt their hearts beating in unison, as if the world around them had ceased to exist. Meshach hugged Naomi, and she felt her body respond to his touch. At that moment, all her fears disappeared, and all that remained was the desire to be with him, forget about everything and surrender to this feeling completely. She knew that this might be their last moment together, that they had already gone too far, but she couldn't give it up. Her soul was drawn to him as to the source of life, and she could not resist this call. Their kiss was filled with passion and despair, as if they were trying to convey to each other all the feelings that they hid inside. Naomi felt her heart bursting with pain and pleasure as her body burned in the fire they had ignited. She wanted this moment. She wanted to forget about everything, but deep down she knew that this kiss would be the beginning of the end. Suddenly, footsteps were heard from behind the trees. They recoiled from each other, their hearts pounding in their chests like drums. Naomi felt a cold fear run down her spine. She knew it couldn't be anyone else but Tembo. Her husband was returning from the forest, and perhaps this time fate decided to finally expose them. Tembo appeared on the path, his face covered in shadow, but his eyes glittered in the moonlight. He stopped when he saw them, and his gaze froze on their hands, which were still intertwined. A deathly silence hung in the air, which cut through space like a sharp knife blade. Everything froze in anticipation, and it seemed that nature itself froze watching this dramatic scene. Naomi felt her heart sink into her heels and her breathing become ragged. She knew that this moment had come, the moment of truth, the moment that would change everything. She felt panic engulfing her as her mind tries to find a way out of this situation, but does not find it. She saw Tembo's face become firm and determined, and she knew that he had already understood everything. Meshach also stood motionless, his body tense as a taut string. He knew that there was no point in hiding anymore, that everything that had been between them had now opened up like an ulcer that had finally broken through. He saw the pain in his brother's eyes and knew what he had done, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. His love for Naomi was stronger than anything he had ever felt, and he couldn't give up on her, even if it meant betrayal. Tembo slowly approached them, and every step he took reverberated in Naomi's heart like a hammer blow. She couldn't move, couldn't say a word. Thoughts swirled in her head like a whirlwind, but none of them brought salvation. She knew that there was no turning back anymore, that their secret had been revealed, and now they would have to face the consequences. When Tembo stopped in front of them, his face was stony and his eyes were like steel. He looked at them with such hatred and pain that Naomi felt her heart break apart. She saw in his eyes everything they had lost, everything that had been destroyed by their secret bond. It wasn't just jealousy, it wasn't just anger. It was a deep wound they had inflicted on him, and it would never heal. At that moment, the whole world seemed to collapse on them. Naomi felt a sense of guilt and shame sweep over her as her soul screamed in pain. She knew that she had betrayed the man who had always been by her side, who loved her and protected her. She saw his heart being torn apart, and she knew that she would never be able to fix what she had done again. Meshach felt the pain too, but he couldn't back down. He knew that their relationship with Naomi was forbidden, that they had broken all the rules, but he couldn't bring himself to give it up. He knew that this moment would change everything, that he would lose his brother and maybe everything he had, but his love for Naomi was stronger. He was willing to do anything for her, even if it meant losing everything else. Tembo seemed to be holding himself back with difficulty. His fists were clenched and his breathing was heavy. He took another step forward, and Naomi felt fear creep over her. She knew that he could do anything, that something terrible was waiting for them, but she couldn't take her eyes off. At that moment, she was ready to accept any punishment, any retribution for what they had done. And so, when the tension reached its peak, Tembo suddenly turned around and left, leaving them alone on the riverbank. His footsteps resounded in the silence, and each step sounded like a thunderclap. Naomi felt her legs give way, and she sank to the ground, overcome with despair and pain. She knew that their lives would never be the same, that they had lost everything they had, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Meshach came up to her and hugged her, and at that moment they both felt that their fate was now connected forever. They knew what lay ahead: condemnation, hatred, and perhaps exile from the village, but they couldn't give up on each other. Their love was too strong to be ignored, and they were ready to accept all the consequences.